So I've had my Avata 2 for several weeks now, and I've had a chance to try out pretty much all of the features and settings. At least everything that's available when you're using the motion controller. And in this video, I'm going to go through all the controls, the features and settings with the help of some demonstrations and comparisons. Hey everyone, it's Mark with Create and Captivate, and what I've put together for you is the ultimate guide to all the features and settings for the Avata 2 using the Goggles 3 and the Motion Controller 3. And I must say, it's been quite an experience making this video. There was so much to test out, and there were a few mishaps, some broken propellers, but all in all, the Avata 2 held up quite well. And I've had a whole lot of fun with it so far. But there's a lot to cover, so I'm not going to waste any more time, and we're going to jump right into it. All right, I'm going to start by going through the menus available from the main screen. Now, you'll see on the top, left, and bottom, there are little white arrows. These indicate the 3 available menu selections, and pressing the 5D button in the direction of the arrow will open the corresponding menu. Now you can also access the menus using the AR cursor, which is available before takeoff or in flight after pressing the lock button to pause the drone. You can move the cursor around by moving the motion controller and interact with the screen using the trigger. If you hover over one of the arrows and pull the trigger, it will open the corresponding menu, which is the shortcut menu in this case. You can select or deselect options by hovering over them and pulling the trigger. So from this menu, you can start and stop recording. You can enable or disable the enhanced display option, which you don't see in the screen recording, but it enhances the display in the goggles. Now, this is also where you would turn on head tracking. And while we're here, we'll have a quick look at this feature. So when head tracking is turned on, the drone heading and gimbal tilt will track the movements of the goggles. As you can see, the drone rotates as I turn my head from side to side, and the gimbal tilts up and down as I tilt my head back and forth. And if we go into the goggles view, as you're flying around, the center point is tracking your head movements. The circle still tracks the motion controller and indicates the direction the drone is flying. And the gauge at the top of the screen indicates how far off center your head is turned, or the yaw of the drone. One thing I find though is it's very tough to get smooth footage using head tracking unless you're very subtle with your head movements. But it's fun to fly around with once in a while, and you can use it to get some unique perspectives that you wouldn't normally be able to get using the motion controller. Now back to the shortcut menu, this next option allows you to wirelessly share the goggles display to a mobile device, which I'm currently doing with my phone to get this screen recording. And next to that is where you enable or disable the Easy Acro feature. Now you can't turn it on while you're recording, but you can turn it on and then start recording. And once again, since we're here, we'll check out the Easy Acro feature. So when it's enabled, you get a menu on the screen with the option to select slide, 180 drift, or flip. And you can change the selection by rotating the dial on the controller. Now, slide is just the default joystick controls that you normally have. So if I switch it to 180 drift, next to that there are left and right arrows, which indicate the joystick inputs you can use with that selection. So if you push the joystick to the left, the drone will perform the drift, rotating counterclockwise. And if you push it to the right, it will rotate clockwise. Now, if I select the flip option, you have 4 available inputs. So if I push up on the joystick, the drone will do a front flip. And if I push down on the joystick, it will do a back flip. Now, if I push to the left on the joystick, the drone will do a barrel roll to the left, and obviously if I push to the right, it will do a barrel roll to the right. Really, they're kind of fun to mess around with, and they require no skill. If you just want to try it out, you can actually do the flips and barrel rolls just from a hover. Now, obviously you need to be moving for the 180 drift, but I think that one is something you could actually use to capture cool shots, like capturing a subject as you fly by and turn to face the subject as you pull away. One other thing I should mention is you can only perform the Easy Acro moves in normal mode. They don't work in sport mode. And that's about everything to do with Easy Acro, so let's finish up with the shortcut menu. And the next setting is the goggles defog. Enabling this will turn on the goggles cooling fan to help if your lenses are fogging up. And then you have the brightness setting, and you can adjust it with the cursor by holding the trigger and moving the cursor right or left. And to exit out of a menu or setting, you can push forward on the trigger or move the cursor off the menu to an open part of the screen and pull the trigger. Now, if I move over to the arrow on the left, this is the main settings menu, and we'll go through all of these right away, but first I want to show you the last menu on the bottom of the screen, and that's the camera settings. From here, you have access to all the camera settings, so I find it's easier to change them from here rather than the camera settings in the main menu. So while we're here, I'll quickly go through all the available camera settings. And starting on the left is where you can select photo or video mode. I'm going to leave it in video mode because there are settings available for video that aren't available for photo, so this will cover everything. Now the next setting is where you can select auto or manual, but if you select auto, most of the settings won't be available. So I'll leave it in manual, that way I'll have access to all the settings. Now you'll notice the ISO and white balance have A's next to them, which means they're currently in auto. So if I go into the shutter setting and start changing it, you'll notice the image really isn't changing. And that's because the ISO is automatically adjusting to changes in shutter speed to maintain the EV value, which is shown to the right of the shutter setting. But now if I go into the ISO setting and manually set it, you'll see the image changes and so does the EV value. And now if I go back into the shutter setting and start adjusting it, the image and EV value will change accordingly. Now if you're in auto mode, the only exposure setting you have is the EV value, and the ISO and shutter speed automatically adjust based on the EV setting. Next you have the white balance setting, and I often just leave this in auto, but if the lighting conditions are changing, I may set it manually. And to do that, you have to scroll through the settings, and I usually set it close to whatever it's currently reading in auto. Now the max setting is 10,000 Kelvin, and the minimum is 2,000 Kelvin. The next setting is the aspect ratio, and I just leave this in 16:9, but if you're going to be cropping your video, you may want to use the 4:3 setting, which allows you to capture your footage using the full area of the camera's sensor. However, this does change the view in the goggles. Now, the next setting, video quality, has several options, but there's only a few that I ever use. Really, I don't use anything below 4K unless I'm using the 2.7K 120 FPS for slow motion. Other than that, I mostly use 4K 60. These settings will also affect the image quality in the goggles. Now, camera field of view is the next setting, and you have the choice between normal, wide, and ultra wide. I typically use wide, and really the difference between them is quite subtle. It is still noticeable if you compare them, but I think it really comes down to personal preference or what you're trying to capture. This next setting is something you can use rather than manually setting the ISO. And I'm not sure why it's not next to the ISO setting, but this is the auto ISO limit, and it limits the maximum ISO when you have it in auto. So if you just want to ensure the ISO stays below a certain value, you can leave the ISO in auto and set the limit here. The next setting is the electronic image stabilization, or EIS, and you have the choice between horizon steady, rock steady, and off. I usually leave it in rock steady because that gives you stabilization while still allowing the horizon to tilt from side to side. Now, if you want to keep the horizon level, then you can use horizon steady. Or if you want to do the stabilization yourself using free software like GyroFlow, you'll have to turn the EIS off and have the field of view set to wide. And then the gyro data gets saved with the video file, and you can open the video file with GyroFlow and manually stabilize the footage, which is actually pretty easy and gives you a lot of flexibility. Maybe something for another video. But now let's look at the last setting, and that's color. For color, you have the choice between normal and D-Log M. And I find the quality of footage using normal is really good. Now, there are situations like in more extreme lighting where D-Log M will give you a much better image to work with. But then you have to color grade your footage, which can be made a lot easier using the LUT DJI provides on their website. Again, maybe something for another video. But that's it for the camera settings. So now we'll go through everything in the main menu settings. Now, the first selection in this menu is the status. And in here, messages and warnings will be displayed. So if there's a warning or error being displayed on the screen, it will often give more detail in the status window. You can also go up to switch, and selecting that will allow you to switch the aircraft you're connecting to. The next selection is album, and in here you can preview videos from the goggles storage. Below the album is the transmission settings, and in here you can manually set your frequency and bandwidth by switching the channel mode to manual. but this is stuff I just leave in auto. You can also turn on broadcasting from here, which will allow you to share the goggles display with another pair of goggles. But according to the manual, they both have to be goggles 3. It didn't work with my Goggles Integra, so that might be true. And that's basically it for the transmission settings. So now we'll go into the actual settings menu, and we'll start with the safety settings. The first setting here is the max flight altitude, which by default is set to 120 meters. And if the aircraft reaches the max altitude, it will stop from flying any higher. By selecting it, you can change the setting to a maximum of 500 meters and as low as 20 meters. The next setting is the max flight distance, which will limit how far the aircraft will fly from the home point. I just leave this at the default setting, which is no limit, but if you want to set a limit, you could go into the setting and select a distance. Now, the return to home altitude is one of the settings you want to pay attention to. If a return to home is initiated, either from the remote, a low battery, or a lost signal, the drone will raise up to the return to home altitude and then fly back to the home point. So you want to make sure the return to home altitude is higher than any obstacle it may encounter on its way home. Because the Avata 2 doesn't have obstacle avoidance, it won't stop if there's an obstacle in its path. Below that, if you select Update Home Point, the home point will be updated to the current location of the drone. So only select this if you actually want to change the home point. The next 4 selections are for the aircraft and goggles calibrations. If they're showing normal, I wouldn't worry about these. But just to show you, if I select any one of these, you get some initial instructions, and if you want to perform the calibration, select Start. Once you start the calibration, you'll get instructions on performing each step of the calibration. Just follow the instructions, and they're all fairly easy, except the goggles IMU. I had to try this several times to figure it out, and the key to it is you have to lay the goggles in the orientation shown so they're balancing on their own without you supporting them. And then I finally got it to complete. Below the calibration stuff is the camera view before loss, and this can be used to help find the location of your drone. It will play back the last 30 seconds of cached video before signal was lost. But I can't show you because it doesn't show up on the live view. Now, if you haven't lost connection and you're having trouble locating the drone, this next setting, ESC beeping, may be able to help. Select it to turn it on, and the ESC in the aircraft will start beeping to help you locate it. And at the bottom of the safety menu is the advanced safety settings. It's very important that you set this first option appropriately. In most cases, I would have it set to return to home, but remember, if this is initiated, it will automatically raise up to the return to home altitude. So if you're in a forest or in a location where there could be obstacles above, you may want to set it to hover. But I wouldn't likely use land unless I was absolutely certain it would be able to land safely. The other setting in here, emergency propeller stop, if you enable this, you first get a warning that basically explains what this does. And it allows you to stop the propellers in mid-flight in the case of an emergency by pressing the lock button 4 times. It says use with caution because it will cause the aircraft to crash. And that's it for the safety settings. The next selection is the control settings, so let's have a look at those. The first selection in here is the motion controller. And if I had the FPV controller connected, it would display remote controller. But in this video, I'm using the motion controller, so those are the settings we'll go through. So in here you have 3 selections: flight control, gain tuning, and RC calibration. Currently, flight control is selected, and if I go down, the first option is the motion controller instructions, which is a really comprehensive tutorial on the operation of the motion controller. So let's have a look. This first screen just lets you know the aircraft won't respond to controls once you enter this tutorial. Then it explains when the AR cursor is available, and how to recenter the cursor by pressing the dial on the side of the controller. This is something you may need to do at first to get the cursor to show up. And if you're using it and it starts to drift off to one side or another, just press the dial to recenter it. The next screen shows you how to use the cursor, and there are some settings you can select to try it out, but you're not actually changing any settings. These are just for demonstration on how to select items and scroll through menus using the joystick. The next screen shows you how to enable the real view display from the motion controller by double tapping the dial on the side of the controller. You can also double tap the side of the goggles, which is shown in the goggles tutorial. The next screen shows the functions of all the buttons on the controller, starting with the lock button. Pressing twice will start the motors and also stop them. Once the motors are started, you can take off by pressing and holding the lock button. Pressing the lock button while in flight will cause the drone to brake and hover in place. While paused, the drone won't respond to movements of the controller, and the AR cursor becomes available, which is great for making quick changes to the settings. And you can land by pressing and holding the lock button while in flight. Also, while in flight, pressing the mode button will switch between normal and sport mode. If you press and hold the mode button, it will initiate a return to home. And finally, on the handle is the shutter record button. Press it to stop and start recording or take a photo, and press and hold it to switch between photo and video mode. This next screen shows the motion to get the aircraft to ascend or descend while pulling the trigger, but it also shows the two-stop trigger function, which is a new feature on this controller. So when the trigger is not pressed, only the gimbal will respond to movements of the controller. Tilting the controller up and down will cause the gimbal to tilt up and down. And if you pull the trigger to the first stop, which is shown in the close-up image of the trigger, the drone will now respond to the controller tilting from side to side, and the drone will rotate accordingly. Now, the drone will not start to fly forward until you pull the trigger past the first stop, and the further you pull the trigger, the faster the drone will fly. Pulling the trigger and pointing the controller upward will cause the drone to fly forward and upward. And if you tilt the controller downward, the drone will fly forward and downward. Now, if you push the trigger forward, the drone will fly backward. But just remember, when flying backward, the motion controls are reversed. For instance, if you push the trigger forward and point the controller downward, the drone will actually fly backward and upward. The next screen shows the correct motion to control the orientation of the drone while flying. So you want to tilt the controller from side to side, not move it laterally. And this next and final screen shows the joystick controls for the drone. So with the joystick, you can move the drone up, down, left, and right. Just no forward and backward. And now you know everything you need to know about using the motion controller. There is also a setting here to change the hand you're going to use the controller with. I think this maybe changes how it responds to movements, but even though I'm left-handed, I just use it with my right hand anyway. Mainly because the shutter button is not really accessible when holding it with your left hand because it's under your palm. Now, the next section in here is gain tuning. And here you can set the max speed for lateral, vertical, forward, and backward flight. And at the top, you can select normal and sport mode to adjust the settings for each mode. If anything, I would suggest increasing the max lateral and vertical speeds. Those are the movements controlled by the joystick, and by default, they're quite slow. Now, at the bottom, you can reset the settings to default. Just note, the reset only resets the settings for the selected mode. And the last selection in here is the RC calibration. And if you select this, it brings up the options to calibrate various aspects of the controller. Once again, I wouldn't worry about these if they're showing normal. But if you go into them, like the other calibrations, there are some initial instructions and you can select start to proceed with the calibration. And that's everything in the motion controller settings. So getting out of those, below the controller settings is the gimbal pitch speed, and you have three selections here: slow, normal, and fast. This setting will limit the max tilt speed of the gimbal. I typically just leave this in normal, and I find the gimbal tracks my movements quite well. Now, if the gimbal doesn't seem to be functioning correctly, you can calibrate the gimbal from here. Select gimbal calibration, and like the other calibrations, you'll get some initial instructions, and then select start to proceed with the calibration process. The next setting is the units, and this is what will be shown in the goggles display. So I have mine set to metric meters. You could also select kilometers, which only changes the speed indication. Or you can set it to imperial, which will display miles per hour in feet. Below that is turtle mode. So if you've crashed and the aircraft is upside down but still connected, you can enable turtle mode and the aircraft will attempt to flip itself over. Now, beginner mode is something that is enabled by default for the first flight, and it limits the aircraft speed to 1 meter per second, which is extremely slow. So as soon as you figure out how to control the aircraft, you'll probably want to turn this off, and this is where you can do it. You'll get this warning and then just select disable. The last selection in the control menu is the goggles tutorial, and this too is a pretty helpful tutorial for getting familiar with the goggles. The first thing you'll need to do is select a language, and on the screen it also gives you some instructions on using the 5D and back button. Use the 5D button to select next, and then you get some instructions on how to adjust the fit of the goggles. Then it walks you through the IPD and diopter adjustment, which is done using the knobs on the bottom of the goggles. First, you'll need to unlock the knobs by rotating them counterclockwise, and then you can set the IPD by sliding them back and forth to adjust the distance between the lenses and align the image in the goggles. The diopter adjustment is done by rotating the knobs and allows you to adjust the lenses to bring the image into focus. This is helpful for people who require corrective lenses. And to make it a bit easier, the diopter setting for each lens is displayed in the goggles while you're adjusting them. Next, it shows you how to enter the real view display, which changes the display in the goggles to the forward-facing cameras on the front of the goggles. After that, it finishes up by showing how to access the menus on the main screen using the 5D and back button on the goggles. And that's it for the settings in the control menu. The next selection is the camera settings. And most of these we already went through in the camera settings from the main screen. But I'll quickly go into each of these just so you can see what's there. And you'll see these first few options are the same until we get to grid lines. Now, I don't really use these when I'm flying the Avata, but I use them all the time with my Mini 4 Pro to help frame my shots. Just to show you, if I select the third option, you can see what both sets of grid lines look like. But with the Avata, I find the center point is sufficient in most cases. Which also happens to be the next option. From here, you can enable or disable the center point display. The next option allows you to choose your storage location. And to be clear, this is the memory in the aircraft. So I currently have the microSD selected, but I can switch to the internal storage, which is actually quite useful in the Avata 2 because there's 46 gigabytes, which is more than I use most of the times I'm out flying. Under storage, there's the format option. And if you select it, you get the option to select what to format. You can select any of these, but only one at a time. And then you would select confirm to format the selected storage location. Next, we have the advanced camera settings. In here, the first option allows you to select what will record when you start a recording. I just leave this on both, so whenever I'm recording, I get the recording from the goggles and the drone. You just have to be sure to have a memory card in the goggles since they don't have any internal storage. This next setting, camera view recording, may not be the best description for this setting, but turning it off removes the information displayed from the goggles recording, so it basically looks the same as the recording from the camera. Now, auto record on takeoff is the setting I don't usually have turned on, but sometimes wish I did when I forget to press record. But if you turn this on, as soon as you take off, recording will automatically start. The next setting is the color mode. And this gives you the same color options as the main screen camera menu. Now below that we have sharpness and noise reduction settings. By default they are set to 0, which means you have some sharpening and noise reduction effects being applied to your footage. You can change the settings here, and if you want to completely disable them, you can set them to -2. The anti-flicker setting I just leave in auto. You can also turn it off or set it to 50 or 60 Hz. And it's supposed to help reduce flicker if your lighting is coming from unnatural light sources. The video subtitles, I just keep this off. It's an extra file that gets saved with every recording, and it contains a bunch of telemetry information. If you open up the video and turn on subtitles and point to the SRT file, the telemetry information will be displayed with the video. And that's it for the advanced camera settings. And the last option in the camera menu is Reset Camera Parameters, which does just that. If you select it, you'll get a confirmation, then select Confirm to reset the camera parameters back to default. The next selection from the main menu is the display settings. And the first setting is the brightness, which is used to adjust the goggles display. It's the same setting from the shortcut menu with the slider bar, except here it's a numbered setting. Below that is the display scaling, and from here you can reduce the size of the display in the goggles.
So maybe if you find it hard to see the very edges of the display, you could reduce the display scaling to say 80 or 90%, which may allow you to better see the whole display. Now, I'm not sure why anyone would want to go down to 50%, but you have the option. The next setting is your home point, and I just leave this on. When it's on, it displays an H on the screen showing you where the home point is, which I find quite handy. If you're finding the lenses are fogging up in your goggles, you can turn on the goggles defog, which just turns on the goggles cooling fan and runs it at high speed. And the last two settings in here are for the real view display. I can't really demonstrate much with this because it doesn't show up on the screen recording. But if the Enable Real View PIP is turned on, when you enable Real View, a small display from the drone camera will appear in the upper corner while showing the view from the forward-facing cameras on the main display. Now, if you disable picture-in-picture, you can switch the Real View display to 3D, and that changes the Real View display in the goggles to look 3D, and it actually does a really good job. But I'd rather have picture-in-picture when I'm using the Real View display. And those are all the display settings. The last selection is the About section, which for the most part contains a bunch of information about your equipment like firmware revisions and serial numbers. There's also a selection for setting up an OTG connection between the goggles and another device. Below that, there's some compliance information, and from here you can also change the language selection. And lastly, there are some resets. The first one, Reset All, will just restart the aircraft and goggles if you select it and choose OK. The next one, Clear All Data, will actually erase all of the information that is shown on this display. This is something you would use if you were getting rid of the drone for any reason. Other than that, you probably wouldn't use this option, but it's good to know where to find it. And that's it. That's all the settings. Now, there's just one last thing I want to go through, and that's the screen display in the goggles. So when you're flying with the goggles, you'll have a bunch of information displayed across the bottom of the screen. And starting from the left is the flight mode indicator. It will display N when you're in normal mode, and S when you're in sport mode. Next to the flight mode is the flight telemetry displays, and they're shown in the units selected in the control settings. So next to the H, the height from the home point is displayed, and above it, the vertical speed is displayed. And next to the D, the distance from the home point is displayed, and above that, the horizontal speed is displayed. And if an object or the ground is detected by the downward sensors, a warning indicating the distance is displayed to the right of the flight telemetry. Now, moving over to the right side, the first display is the battery life. The percent remaining is shown in the battery icon, and next to that, the flight time remaining is displayed. To the right of those, there are two icons for indicating signal strength. The top icon is for the controller signal, and the bottom is for the goggles or image transmission signal. Next to those is the current video bitrate for the live view display. And then there's the GNSS status. Basically, white indicates a strong signal, orange is a weak signal, and red is extremely weak or unavailable. And the last indication on the bottom of the screen is the goggles battery life remaining. Now, above the indications on the right side is where notifications will be displayed. And lastly, above that is the storage information. The aircraft remaining storage is displayed on the top and the goggles on the bottom, if there's an SD card in the goggles. Otherwise, just the aircraft storage is displayed. And that's all I have for this video. Hopefully this has given you a better understanding of all the available settings and features. Maybe even given you some ideas and things you want to try. So don't forget to like the video, and if you like this type of content, you should check out some of my other videos. And also, if you're not already subscribed, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.